Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in South Asian Studies. I'm one of your co-hosts, Sami Siddiqui. Today I'm speaking to Dr. David Weevers about his wonderful new book, The Origins of the British Empire, 1600 to 1750, published by Cambridge University Press last year. Dr. Weevers is Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at Queen Mary, University of London. Welcome to New Books in South Asian Studies, Dr. Weevers. So our first question is always biographical. Where did you grow up, and how did you become interested in the history of the British Empire and the East India Company?
Thank you, Sammy, and also obviously thank you for welcoming me onto the podcast. It's much appreciated. So I grew up in the south of England. I've been in the same town all my life. I've obviously travelled around for study and work, but I live in a quaint seaside town on the English Riviera, on just outside Brighton. And I went to University of Kent. I did my degrees there. And then moved on. I did a postdoc there as well, so I spent a lot of time at University of Kent. And then moved on to Queen Mary to do my Leverhulme. And in October, I'll be joining the University of Warwick. So that's sort of my background. How I became interested in the topic. Really, I mean, I'm not ashamed to admit this because I think it shows the importance of being educated on this. But I came into the British Empire sort of in my undergraduate period through just enjoying the sort of boys' own adventure stories of empire, of these adventurous European men out in the kind of non-European world. It's mysterious and dangerous, and they had these heroic exploits. So this is how I actually came to the topic of the British Empire in my undergraduate study. And then it doesn't take long to be educated in empire to realise that's probably about as far from the truth as possible. And so, once I'd read my Edward Said and dipped my toe into new imperial histories, which was sort of taking off around the time I was doing my undergraduate degree, and then global history by the time I was into my master's, and then appreciating that these are, Victorian fantasies of empire that, reproduce certain racial inequalities and prejudices. These are part of the discourse of empire. So I came at it in that very perverse way, but then really appreciated that actually empire is as a topic is a fantastic segue into revealing a much deeper and richer history, which is one in which Europe was not the center of the world, and suddenly you crack an egg and you open up all these marvelous different histories from all these wonderful different countries and periods. So and then I really, for the East India Company, there was a specific book, The Honourable Company by John Key, a Scottish historian, and it's probably one of my favourite narrative histories that's also expertly researched, and that was so influential. And I thought, wow, this is probably the most interesting historical subject I've ever read. It's absurd, this kind of small kind of a group of merchants. And I was interested in, as everyone was coming at this topic, in the early noughties, is how did it transform into this big empire? I was really interested in that history. But what I found interesting about Key's book is that he stops sort of around the late 18th century. He doesn't, this isn't a full history of the company. And I think one of the reasons why is because there's just so many different. The history of the East India Company is many histories of many different kind of iterations of empire and Europeans in Asia. So that's kind of how I came to it, and that's kind of my background. And I think it's interesting that as kind of like a white male growing up in the south of England, that's naturally the way I came to this topic, through the glory of empire. But that's why I think it's so important that we write this sort of history so people are quickly disabused of the kind of romanticism of empire, which is obviously a big discussion in the public sphere at the moment, about empire and its legacy. So so a kind of complicated segue into it.
No, thank you. And you've kind of already addressed, how you came to this project a little bit. I was wondering if you could talk about how, why you decided to write this particular book.
Yeah, I think, really this came through being really dissatisfied with the state of the field, really in two ways. One, I felt that there was a big divide in the historiography of the East India Company, and it was for me quite clearly split between Western historiographies that take the East India Company as the point of perspective or the lens through which to understand, empire in Asia, and a separate Asian historiography by mostly Asian historians that place the East India Company within the context of the kind of wider political and economic context of Asia at the time. So, looking at the East India Company, through the lens of the Mughal Empire or Tokugawa Japan. So for me, there was kind of two his separate historiographies, not necessarily in conversation. Every now and then you get a brilliant historian like Sanjay Subramaniam who could cross that and integrate those. But I felt like that hadn't been done for a general history of the East India Company. So it's about bringing those two historiographies together, which were very similar in many ways. They were just before I started writing the book, they were both interested in empire as a kind of decentered process. If you look at historians of the Mughal Empire, especially Asian historians, they were looking at the Mughal Empire not as a kind of centralized structure, but as a kind of a network of clients and allies being mobilized by the imperial center and being enfranchised as a way to uphold Mughal authority, which I found interesting. If you think about Rajput princes or even the African city naval power. And then sort of Western historiographies that were looking at the company and the English state as a decentered process, and looking at everything from Matthew Braddock's work on the formation of, or English state formation as a kind of as a bundle of networks out in the provinces, to Phil Withington's idea of corporations and towns being enfranchised, and then all tracing that all the way to the lineage of Phil Stern's groundbreaking work in 2011 on sovereignty as kind of a bundle of hyphens, as overlapping kind of messy matrix of different autonomous bodies. So I thought these two separate historiographies were doing the same thing, more or less, understanding state and empire and sovereignty in the same way, but not really necessarily being integrated. So I kind of set out to do that. The other one really was being a bit dissatisfied with the direction that those historiographies were going, especially those concerned with the English East India Company. So thinking about Phil Stern's book, The Company State, which is probably I think the most groundbreaking work on the East India Company really ever, probably. And for me, up until Phil Stern's work in 2011, which was just as I finished my masters, but before then, I think the research or the historiography had become somewhat stale on the East India Company, and we were still following that trade to empire narrative and doing lots of exciting work on commerce and trade and the company. But his focus on the company as a political actor, I think, really opened up all these new directions and all these exciting research that we're seeing now in the field, and it's made study of the company far more of a kind of diverse and interdisciplinary one as well. So that was great. But in many ways, his work accidentally, also by looking at the company as a political actor, accidentally pushed us in a direction in which we consider the company far more capable than it was. Suddenly the company was this aggressive political actor capable of building colonies and an empire, and as early as the 17th century. And for me, having been working on the East India Company for a couple of years by that point, I did my undergraduate dissertation, and by then I just finished my masters. And looking at the sources, I just didn't see that capability. I saw the company wanting to be capable in the archives, but I didn't really see the evidence of that. So it may have conceptualized itself as a political actor, one capable of building colonies and things, but that success was really elusive. So for me, I wanted to kind of to rein in the direction the historically was heading, and to say, look, the company may have had political ambition in Asia earlier than we thought, but to suggest that it succeeded is really in a way to undermine the power and complexity of the Asian states and empires the company interacted with. So I wanted to change that direction somewhat. So really this book came from being dissatisfied with the way things were heading, but also building on that new direction. I think I hope I've done that, but
Absolutely.
we'll see.
Absolutely, and the main argument of your book, which I think encapsulates this idea, can be summarized, I think, in this quote from your introduction, and I quote: "The English East India Companies did not grow outside or at the expense of the Asian states that they came into contact with, but rather flourished within the carapace of their expansive Asian hosts. In this sense, this book emphasizes the Asian genesis of the British Empire." End quote. I was wondering if you could expand on this and talk about how this differs from how the company has been discussed in the literature.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that's really the key sentence of the whole book, and it's about, for me, it was really about most histories of empire in Asia, British Empire in Asia, or European Asia, really, European Empire in Asia, or the East India Company. They tend to take Europe as the starting point. And that's partly influenced by the archive, in which the kind of dominant leather-bound tomes are orders and dispatches from London out to the factories and settlements in Asia. And so you get a very kind of skewed a perspective of where power lays within the East India Company and who's calling the shots and who's in the driving seat. I think if you shift away from the official correspondence, so you look more at try and build a sort of almost like live picture of what was going on in these factories and in these company settlements, and you can do that by looking at things like memorandum and private papers and even factory diaries, which, although to a degree official in that they're often dispatched back, still record the kind of daily life and record dissenting opinions and bring in witnesses, and this is where we really capture the kind of non-European voice in the company's development. So it was about kind of rejecting the official correspondence and diving more into these kind of more interesting documents. And I found that Europe is by no way the starting point for understanding how the company develops in the 17th and early 18th century. Instead, in fact, I think power lays not in London or Amsterdam, but really it's in Agra, or it's in Murshidabad, or it's in Banton, or those sorts of places. It's with the interactions between the company's servants, who are, in terms of communication, years from home, and are not really being. I can't remember which historian said it. Possibly Phil Stern, but there's no. They've described it as a great hierarchy or chain linking the outposts all the way to London. Yeah, that doesn't really exist in any sense, and they're kind of doing their own thing. Every few years there's some kind of loose intervention, but so there's kind of these autonomous actors thousands of miles from Europe, interacting with far more dominant and capable forces like the Mughal Empire, or the Sultanate of Jambi, or Tokugawa Japan, and that creates an entirely different dynamic from, this is what London wants, and we must build the colony of Bombay. Actually, that's not how it happens. Development comes as a result of interactions between powerful Asian elites and very subservient Europeans who are really running around doing whatever they want, and therefore the genesis of empire, of course, to an extent, empire comes from a kind of domicile context. England had, or Europe had, particular ambitions and expansionist tendencies, but the shape of empire, the way it develops and the way it looks and operates, is engineered entirely through what Asian states and empires would permit and allow. So for me, I saw this, I did see a kind of expansive East India Company. The East India Company in 1600 is not the same as it is in 1750.
Mhm.
It's has developed, and it's developed in an expansive way. But then, there's, for me, that wasn't mutually exclusive to a resilient and expansive Asian state and empire kind of landscape. And we see, the period in which the company is developing, expanding, is also the height of Mughal expansion, or it's the height of the expansion of the Sultanate of Golconda in central and southern India. So how can
Mhm.
these two things be expanding at the same time? And I didn't feel like there was an answer for that. So I feel like if we came away from London and looked at what was going on within the local Asian context, then that answer would become clearer. And I think that by looking or placing the company's expansion within the expansion of the Mughal Empire, for example, these things are not, mutually exclusive, but in many ways they're dependent of one another. The reason the company expands so quickly in India is because it is facilitated by a domestic imperial power, the Mughal Empire, that
Mhm.
wants powerful and capable subordinate actors to uphold its own authority. Not for a second would the Mughal Empire have tolerated a European colony in its midst, any more than England would have tolerated a Mughal colony, on the bank of the Thames, unless
Mhm.
that was wanted, unless that was something that was facilitated. Thinking like the Hanseatic League in Europe in the sort of 15th and 16th centuries, in many ways, it's a bit like that. The Tudor state wanted a kind of vibrant German commercial actor in its midst to help the cloth trade. Well, it's the same in Mughal India. The Mughal authorities want a kind of loyal subordinate actor that's going to import, tons of silver and gold, and defend maritime borders and pay taxes and drive trade and economic activity.
Mhm.
And the company is willing to do that because it's far more profitable and successful strategy than rampaging around Asia, spending money on ships and on wars. And I think that's very much the dynamic that we see.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I thought it was a really convincing argument, and came throughout your book. So thank you for laying that out for us. Now, could you talk about why you chose to end the story in 1750? If I'm not wrong, this points to an important argument you're trying to make about the history of the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was on purpose, and it was, I think, a somewhat controversial thing to do, ending a book on the British Empire in Asia, when almost every, I think, book at that point really began from the
Mhm.
1750s. Obviously, this is the 1757 is very famous, and really since I'd say um, contemporary times had really been taken as the point in which the British Empire began. 1757, the Battle of Plassey, when the company defeats the Nawab of Bengal and assumes or begins to assume political power in Bengal, Orissa, and Bihar. And I think by purposely ending the book there, I mean, I was making a point that the empire did not begin at the Battle of Plassey, but that kind of empire, that kind of imperial expansion, Europe, the projection of European military and fiscal power over the non-European world. That's not the empire I'm talking about in the early modern period. That, for me, is a slightly more distinct, for certainly in the British context. Excuse me. That's certainly more of a
Mhm.
kind of distinct later modern version of empire that we see in Asia. For most of this period, for the century and a half, which the book discusses, empire for Britain in Asia was a very subordinate, suppliant process, which fed off the power, um, but limited or contained itself within the structures of sovereignty of Asian states. So these
Mhm.
are, in a way, um, I think there are massive continuities before in the pre-Plassey period and the post-Plassey period. I don't think it's the jarring, transformative date that historians for a couple of centuries now have convinced us it has been. This kind of trade to empire narrative. The company is a peaceful trading corporation, and then Battle of Plassey happens in 1757, and suddenly it's a great imperial power. That's not the case,
Mhm.
but I think we can underplay the Battle of Plassey as well. What happens after 1757 it is by the sort of late 18th, early 19th centuries that there has been a a kind of transformative shift in the company's strategy towards war and imperial expansion. So, in a way, by stopping at 1750, I was highlighting the fact that this early modern company development was one that happened within the Asian state and imperial structures that existed. The company worked within them; it contained itself, and it derived much of its power and its economic success from Asian, pre-existing Asian frameworks and contexts. So the story of the company's development is a story of the power and success of Asian states and empires. After 1750, that strategy, that dynamic takes a long time to dissipate, and really even by the sort of 1780s, the company is still overly reliant on certainly post-Mughal structures of power to operate within. The kind of the version of indirect rule, acknowledging the Mughal emperor's sovereignty, adopting aspects of Mughal culture, and yet there has been a shift to more imperial ideologies, and there's a much greater concentration of military and fiscal resources that are projected in India. So in ending in 1750, I was making the point that that this earlier period is a different dynamic. The success of the company is really about its ability to play nice and subordinate and serve the interests of Asian elites as much as London shareholders or European investors.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So, for the listeners who may not be familiar with this period, I was wondering if you could talk about what distinguishes early modern states, economics, international order from what we call the modern world. Perhaps we could limit this to Europe and Asia, which are the focus of your study.
Oh, wow, that's a good question. So I think a little. It ties a little bit into the what I was just talking about. There is that. And I think a lot of historians of empire would probably put sort of the later 18th century as the cutting off point, between discussing early modern British Empire in Asia and then its more modern successor. For me, really, I think sometimes this can be overstated, but I think probably picking out the kind of single biggest distinguishing factor, I think, is that tendency to centralize. So I think the early modern world, if we think about states and economies, and certainly the international order, it's far more complex, it's far more diverse. And just thinking about England, for example, and let's say the Mughal Empire, is that as the research of the past 20 years has shown, these are highly decentered structures of sovereignty and power. So in the English state, it's that you've got networks of corporations and boroughs and towns and charters, universities. These are all operating as autonomous actors, tied together in a kind of royal framework of power. But look at the English, the beginning of English overseas activity. It's outsourced by the crown to a whole group of different actors. So you've got the kind of even just the passage trying to get to India, the Northwest Passage Company and the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company. These companies are formed by private individuals in conjunction with the state to try and open up passages to India and to trade to the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Tsar, and eventually to colonize Northeast Atlantic. It's very rarely done directly by the state itself, partly because the state can't afford to commit seriously to overseas enterprise, because England in the early 17th century is quite an impoverished, marginal state. But partly because that's the way in which the state operates in the early modern period. It's very decentered. Autonomous yet subordinate actors draw constitutional authority from the centre, from the crown, but act rather autonomously and pursue their kind of individual enterprises. Doesn't mean that they are not connected and integrated. Certainly are. That's the massive role networks and private networks play to kind of integrate English overseas activities, whether it's Asia or the Atlantic. But these things are being pursued rather autonomously. And I think, that we get that from the Mughal Empire as well, obviously. So if we look at, there are obviously the massive military interventions of the imperial centre, thinking about Aurangzeb's campaigns in central India and down to the Muslim sultanates. But once the major military campaigns are done, and I'm thinking in 1688, the Mughal conquest of the Golconda Sultanate, immediately those territories are provided with autonomy. Aurangzeb declares that their governments and constitutions shall remain the same as they were before the conquest. And, elites are placed in positions of power and given relative autonomy and usually retain much of their rights beforehand. And then those new territories are eventually enfranchised with more powers and then utilized to uphold Mughal authority in those areas. So, and I'm just thinking about Mughal naval power, which again is about utilizing subordinate actors to do the centre's bidding, whether it's the European East India companies or the city based on the west coast of India. So these states are operating the same way. They're highly decentered. They operate, or power and economic power is actualized through enfranchising and utilizing a whole network of different subordinate actors. And I think that's really what highlights the early modern period or distinguishes it from the modern period. And I think much of the modern period, especially we're thinking about Europeans in Asia and with the origins of empires, that what you get certainly from the late 18th century is an attempt to centralize a lot of this, a lot of these dynamics. So thinking in terms of the English East India Company begins to lose its autonomous status. Parliament begins to exercise more oversight, thinking of the various India Acts that are passed in the late 18th century. A Governor General is appointed to oversee all of the various presidencies. The company loses control eventually of its trade, its monopoly, and there's a board of control established by Parliament. And therefore, gradually, the company's autonomy is eroded, and the British state, far more capable than its predecessor, the English state, steps in and exercises a greater degree of central control. So I think that's kind of the defining feature of the modern period. How successful that centralization is, of course, is arguable, and I think that well into the 19th century, the British presence in India is still, highly decentralized. But it's the attempt to centralize, to legislate, to intervene, and to undermine the autonomy of these, in a way, leftovers from the early modern period. Is an interesting one. And actually, I read recently a really interesting book by Andrew Phillips and Jason Sharman, which is called Outsourcing Empire, and it does a really good job of showing the early modern world and its distinction from the later modern period as being one that was empire was almost entirely autonomous from Europe. It doesn't let empire off. It doesn't let it off in a way that suggests that Europeans are not fault for what happens. It's that the strategies and the processes of European expansion are very much in the hands of these independent individual associations and corporations and companies. So I think that creates a far more complex, but almost in a far way more exciting and diverse international early order in the early modern period. And I think a lot of that is eroded by the early 19th century. And I think there's a more homogenous European presence across the world. And I think that's in a way that's quite tragic.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you for laying that out. So you begin the book talking about Robert Fleetwood, a company servant who was married to Marjorie Winter, a Eurasian daughter of an Indo-Portuguese couple. You write that Fleetwood's experience in the Godavari Delta illustrates that, quote, "The world of the company servant in Asia was a culturally amorphous and politically entangled one," end quote. Could you expand on this and tell us why you decided to begin the book with Fleetwood?
You keep quoting my book back to me, and I'm like, well, that's good writing. I don't remember writing that. That's such a good
It
sentence.
is.
I could use some of that writing now. Yeah, I thought Fleetwood was a really interesting place to start because it's interesting. There's no extant primary sources on Fleetwood. I had to piece
Hmm.
him together in his interesting, complex world through various appearances in the official record, and then I found one helpful private paper then. A memorandum, I should say, not a private paper, which really gave us a good glimpse into this world that he had assembled.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I decided to begin with Fleetwood because he really represented the way in which Europeans could flourish in India only by crossing boundaries. Really, is a good way to put it. Not just political and diplomatic boundaries, but social and cultural ones as well, and even linguistic and sexual boundaries. And here was a chief of the company's factory in just outside Masulipatam on the Coromandel coast, and the Godavari Delta was this kind of quite affluent, commercially vibrant region of the Sultanate, the Golconda Sultanate. So his main job was to order textiles. This is a very textile rich area of the coast, and one of the key areas which the company exported textiles, not just to Europe but also to Southeast Asia. So he had quite an important job. So he's an English official, and yet what happens is over the course of about a decade, he starts to farm or lease the surrounding towns and villages of this company factory. And
Hmm.
within a decade, he is essentially acting as the Golconda governor of this big kind of kind of chiefdom in a way. He's assembled this collection of towns and villages with whom he raises revenue, taxation. He has a judicial responsibility as well. And it's interesting, really interesting. I thought, well, why is this happening? And part of the answer, I think, is because he's become culturally integrated into the Godavari Delta in a way that I hadn't yet seen at that point. So his Indo-Portuguese wife is actually the daughter of an old governor of Madras, an interesting guy himself. And he has become. He clearly lives very comfortably in a world of partnerships with local merchants and Mughal elites and Golconda chiefs, and he
Hmm.
is dining with them. He's sailing around with them. He's going into business with them, and he's got this kind of expansive Indo-Portuguese family living in the area. So at one point, when the company order him to kind of hand these towns over, what do you think you're doing, assembling this kind of private domain? And the guy sent to do this is like, oh, we can't. This guy is so well enmeshed in his surroundings. His family is so numerous, and he's got all these associations and businesses that we can't really just kind of pull him out. So so this it's it, and then at one point the Sultan comes and to kind of travel in the region, and it's with Fleetwood he stays, not necessarily because he's the English chief, but also because he's become this really important Golconda official responsible for raising revenue and maintaining law and order in this part of the Sultan's domains. And I thought it was just a really interesting, rich dynamic. It shows the way in which the company wasn't operating as a kind of foreign body,
Hmm.
and that it was really integrated in a really messy way. So this wasn't the company; this was an individual company servant doing it without the company's authority or knowledge. And when he's found out, the company, instead of just doing the whole thing, they actually take over the towns from him. And carry on acting as the kind of Golconda official in that region. And they allow Fleetwood to retain control of one of his villages where his family lives. So it's
Hmm.
not that the company, this isn't corruption, this isn't wayward servants' private interest, as the historiography would say. This was company servants integrating into this cultural and social world, acquiring political and commercial power, and then the company utilizing that to their benefit. So it's this entangled, messy integration but we cannot what the Fleetwood example shows is we can't speak of the company operating outside of these local frameworks of power. They're inside of it, and that's the way they flourish and they succeed. And the company's presence in the Godavari Delta is very successful. It's one of the key areas of the textile trade for the company. It's because of people like Fleetwood integrating and immersing themselves, marrying local women or Indo-Portuguese women, maintaining very, very close social and commercial relationships with local elites, becoming an important part of the Golconda world as much as the world of the company. So that by the late 17th century, those two worlds are, the lines between them are really blurred and porous. And that's so the Fleetwood example was a really good case study to open the book to show the reader that we can't think of these things separately.
Absolutely. And just a quick follow-up, thinking about Fleetwood and Marjorie Winter, I was wondering how, you would characterize the, sexual relations and marriage in this period, rather than viewing it in romanticized ways, as I've kind of read some places. I'm assuming there were diverse marriage arrangements, formal, informal, and sexual relations, coercive, non-coercive.
Yeah, absolutely. So many wonderful historians have done some great work on this. Derba Ghosh, I think, is a fantastic scholar for this. But yeah, Alison Games has done lots of work on this, especially in the Japanese context. But absolutely, it was, we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that these Europeans fell in love with local women, and they were building happy families, and that tended to be the exception. I think it was far more common. First of all, these marriages were not European marriages. They were often temporary, and whilst far more company servants actually stayed and lived in India than we've actually suspected, and we often think of this. Have this narrative of them going over to India, marrying, getting richer, then leaving and going back to England to buy a parliamentary seat, maybe later on. But in this earlier period, most of them actually stay and live here, and they're not as transient as we think. However, the marriages, so even the official marriages, they're temporary associations, and they're not recognised by the company. But really more common is liaisons of a kind of sexual nature that are not married. They're not marital. There's no legal rights. These are temporary unions, often violent. What we would define as I think as rightly so as violent, and also a fair share of rape as well. So especially in the company factories in Japan, for example, local women were almost treated as property and bought and sold and even passed around the various East India Company servants, and many of these were underage as well. So it's a kind of really kind of violent kind of interaction that these European men are having with local women, and then kind of somewhere in the middle of these. The later kind of lexicon we use for the kind of later 18th, 19th century is, mistresses, the Indian mistress. In this earlier period, in the 17th century, they are usually women with an elite status from a kind of wealthy Indian or Indo-Portuguese family, and the union is driven by kind of mutual interests. So for the family of the woman, it's usually as a way to gain or to consolidate relationships with the East India Company. And they usually follow a pre-existing kind of commercial business relationship between that European individual and the Indo or Indo-Portuguese family. And on the company servants' behalf, it's usually as a way to expand their interest with this particular group. So the marriages or the interactions between company servants and local women have a kind of commercial or patronage motive behind them. So yeah, there's a whole range going from the kind of informally married all the way through to kind of violent sexual encounters in which local women are kind of powerless and used almost as property. So we have to think very diversely. We have to disabuse ourselves that this is a kind of William Dalrymple, white Mughals,
That's the
everyone.
one I was thinking about.
No,
Yeah.
and that is the dominant narrative I think we have. And but if all you need to do is peek at the records of the factories in Japan to see that that's really not the case. And a lot of it is just sexual as well. So. These small factories and settlements have hardly any European women in them. So at one point, the company writes to its servants at Bombay to encourage the European soldiers there to marry and settle down with Indian women as a way to help the settlement grow, because they're not getting European women, so you should encourage them to procreate and drive a kind of demographic revolution in those settlements. So it was always also being manipulated at higher levels within the company itself as like a strategy for the company to grow its presence. So yeah, I think a diverse set of arrangements is a good way to think about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's really helpful. So would the rulers in India have seen these English company servants in the same way they saw the Portuguese or French at this time? And how does the East India dynamic in India compare with, say, the VOC in Japan? I ask because something I really enjoyed about your work is how you're making these comparisons throughout the book.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, because I think it's a complex one as well, and also I think because of the sources, quite a difficult one to get a full answer on. I think two things really. The first is that there is evidence that we do see that that Asian rulers often approach the Europeans as a kind of as a group, as a kind of homogenous kind of blob in a way. And what we get by the turn of the 18th century are the farmers, the charters that the Mughal emperor is granting is often kind of the same for all Europeans. This is a kind of a well trod path that they're not tailored to individual European East India companies. It's like the companies may do this, and the Mughal emperors are kind of treating them in a kind of same way. I think that's on purpose. I think the Mughal empire wants to reduce Europeans to a kind of vassalage relationship where they have the same rights and can be used in the same way. Partly because they provide the same service. They import silver and gold, and they act like maritime actors, and therefore they're treated quite similarly. And I think outside of the Indian subcontinent, for example, in the Indonesian archipelago, I think where there is more of a antagonistic relationship where Europeans and even the English East India Company are acting more aggressively and attempting to establish their dominance, then they are often looked upon as the same. Whether it's the Portuguese, the Dutch, or the English, then there's they have to be kind of resisted, and they are external actors attempting to compromise kind of indigenous structures. So there is a tendency, but I think that does a disservice to Asian rulers and elites, suggesting that somehow that they're kind of far less complex and too simple to understand the differences. And I think that's a narrative that's often been pushed. The Europeans referred to as the hat people, blah blah. Yeah, they were in a way, but the Mughal Empire, for example, was far too sophisticated to not understand the differences between, for example, the Dutch and the English. The English were painfully aware of the comparisons that were often made between them and the Dutch, and the English always being seen as the weaker of the two. And the Mughal Empire was well aware of this and would often try and play Europeans off against one another. The relationship that the Mughal Empire had with the Portuguese, for example, that had well-established colonies, a significant military presence in the early 17th century, created a radically different dynamic than the English. In a way, the English are successful because they're seen as powerless by the Mughal Emperor. They are not a problem. So they're welcomed into Bengal, for example. They're welcomed into Surat. With the Portuguese, the Mughal Empire is well aware that they can't be subordinated, and brought into the Mughal imperial system. In fact, they're treated as an external antagonist. And, by the early 17th century, the Mughal Empire is dealing with them in a confrontational way. For example, the conquest of Hooghly in Bengal is the Portuguese are just far more of a threat. The English are not. So the English are powerless, and in a way, that's the strength that they have to play to, because it allows them to integrate and enjoy the kinds of rights within the Mughal Empire in terms of customs-free trade and things like that the Portuguese can't access because they're seen as too powerful and too dangerous. So I think it does Asian states and empires a disservice to suggest that they can't really distinguish, or that they treat Europeans all the same. I don't think that's the case. It's certainly not the case like you mentioned some of the comparisons. In Japan, for example, when the Tokugawa Bakufu, the shogunate, is really good at finding useful Europeans and treating the less useful Europeans with disdain. So the Dutch really, the English and Dutch are really in many ways similar in Japan, in that they're trying to establish a kind of Japanese Southeast Asian commercial network, and it doesn't really work. But what the Dutch are fantastic at is then pivoting towards China and understanding that the key to unlocking Japanese trade is the Chinese silk trade, and the English can't do that, mostly because they don't have the resources that the Dutch do. And the Tokugawa shogunate understands that, and so the Dutch are rewarded and franchised, and the English, as well as the Portuguese and other Europeans, are eventually forced out of Japan because they can't do anything that the Dutch don't already do and do better. So I think there's a really good sense. I mean, and some of the sources are really clear about this. So in Banten, for example, on the island of Java in Southeast Asia, the English are so make a conscious effort to utilize the indigenous hatred of the Dutch. When the Dutch rock up in Banten in 1598, they bomb the port because Sultan won't let them trade there because the Portuguese are quite well entrenched. And when they come back a few years later, they're allowed to trade there, but they're not. But the indigenous Javanese hate the Dutch, and the English play up to this, and they create a song that they go around singing in the streets. Hate the Dutch and love the English, sort of thing. So they're very conscious that they're seen as very differently, but that's, I think, something that is facilitated by the Asian states and elites that the Europeans operate with. That it all brings something different to the table, and those differences can be exploited.
Great, thank you so much. That was a big cluster of questions there. So thank you so much for answering that. So your book is split into 4 sections. I'll just list them briefly for the listeners. Part 1 is weakness and adaptation. Part 2 is subordination and expansion. Part 3 is limitations and devastation. And part 4 is empire. With that out of the way, I was wondering if you could begin discussing part 1 by talking about the false starts of the company in India in the early 17th century. Something I found interesting is that rather than viewing the company as a monolithic entity, there seems to have been an often tense dynamic between the corporate and metropolitan authorities on the one hand, and company servants in India on the other.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do, or one of the things that I found, is that very few histories of the company start at the beginning. They often start, as I said, it's from 1757, but those that deal with the earlier period even then don't start in 1600 when the company is formed. A lot of them, so for example, Phil Stone's excellent book, The Company State, actually begins really from 1658 when the company get a charter from Oliver Cromwell to become a permanent joint stock corporation. This is the beginning of the company that we know, but actually there's still, half a century of a really interesting history. And I think, having then studied it and researched it, I realized that I think, most people don't study it because it just seems as a series of catastrophes that the company then kind of leave behind them. But really, it's the kind of the failures of the early 17th century which, in a way, shape the strategies and the dynamic pursued by the company from the later 17th century onwards. They kind of learn from that failure and they play into their weakness and they place themselves within local frameworks of power and economic commercial power as well. So really, the company formed in 1600, and its first decade is a very successful decade. And the company sends fleets that are often enjoying something like 200-300% profit. They participate in the spice trade in Southeast Asia, and they begin to have a presence in India, in Surat on the west coast, in Gujarat. So it's seen as rather successful, and then because it's a small corporation, it's built really as a kind of corporate institutional structure. All of the merchants know each other. The investors are, the investors are all living in the same part of London, and they, there's a strong relationship with the crown. And this is something that Rupali Mishra has written a book recently, that A Business of State, that shows this relationship between the early company and the crown as being quite strong, and therefore it's kind of quite a kind of a closed corporate enterprise, and it's very much pushing English interests overseas in Asia, pursuing diplomatic relationships that help, in a way that are very anti-Iberian, anti-Spanish and Portuguese. And it's about exporting English woolens and finding new markets for them. And then really what we have is by the second decade of the 17th century, a number of things start to happen. One is that the company realizes that it's not really succeeding in upholding English interests. It can't find those markets for English woolens. What the English don't realize is no one in kind of tropical Southeast Asia wants to wear English woolens. They can't compete to Chinese or Japanese silk, or the kind of luxurious Indian calicos. There's just no comparison. And there's they find they have to export English silver. They have to pay cold hard cash if they want anything. So and they're too weak to take on England's enemies in Asia, whether it's the Spanish or the Portuguese, and increasingly the Dutch as well, and therefore acting as a kind of as a loyal and subordinate arm of the English state is actually harming the East India Company. It wants to be free to trade and to cross kind of boundaries, and to work with actors that the English state probably wouldn't work with. So it's starting to struggle, and it's the heady days of hundreds of thousands of pounds of investment are starting to dry up. Europe is undergoing a bit of an economic crisis by the 1620s, 1630s. There's a whole different bunch of reasons for this. There's the kind of inflation crisis that partly brought in by the influx of Spanish silver. There's a crisis of liquidity and credit, and the company's finding it very difficult. There's a 30 Years' War raging as well. The company find it difficult to attract investment. The returns start to dwindle, and the company embroils itself in a unofficial war with the Dutch East India Company for access to the spice trade. The Dutch VOC is a far bigger enterprise. Its capital is massive. It has the infrastructure, the ships, and the troops to entrench itself in Asia in a way that the company can't. So it's very quickly on the end of a losing war with the Dutch. It can't attract the investment it could 20 years ago. Its profits are declining, and it's the crown. Its relationship with the crown is strained because it can't export English woolens, and it's accused of draining the English country of its silver by exporting it all overseas. So it really by late 1620s, it's the success, the early success has faded, and the company is actually a struggling enterprise in Asia, and that creates a lot of tension between the company's metropolitan authorities, whether it's the governor and committees that are the executive body of the company, or the court proprietors, the shareholders that vote on issues, or whether it's the Crown or even Parliament, or even the English public. The company, what they want on the one hand, and what the company realize it needs to do to succeed, such as creating cross-cultural relationships and jumping into bed with those people that the English state wouldn't, and avoiding conflict with England's enemies, and all of this stuff. It creates this tension of who is driving the company's development. Is it company servants, or is it metropolitan authorities back home? But really, by the mid-17th century, the company has lost its charter. England, or the British Isles, are gripped in constitutional crisis and civil war. The economic situation hasn't got much better. And it creates this kind of vacuum where the company is almost collapsed at home. And it's so much so that by 1657, it puts the company up for sale. The company puts itself up for sale for, I think, something like £14,000, which is a kind of pittance for half a century of trade in Asia. And so while it's collapsing almost at home, overseas, the companies are sort of left adrift to kind of do what they want. And they can't get the money and the shipping from Europe, so they turn to local elites to help drive not just the company's trade, but their own trade. Most of the people who work for the company are out in Asia, are also feathering their own nests, and they realize that Europe is not going to help them. So for between 1619 and 1621, for example, almost no ships are sent from Europe to the factories in Asia. And in some factories, it's actually starving. They can't even buy rice. So what we get is a general shift in those middle decades of the 17th century towards company servants doing what they want. And they're creating private networks of trade in partnership with Indian elites. They're marrying into elite families to open up access to local patronage, cultural as well as political. They are going out and farming, like Robert Fleetwood, whole villages and towns to raise revenue, and using that revenue to invest in trade and become wealthy. And we've got this one chap, Kogan, who goes out to India around 1630s, and he sees this what he calls this, this monster without a head. So everyone's doing whatever they want. There's no corporate culture. There's no direction. There's no central control. And he describes it as kind of an absolute nightmare. But within that nightmare, what's actually happened is there's been really a shift of power from Europe, from whether it's the corporation of the East India Company or the Crown or the shareholders, to servants out in Asia and the networks and the partnerships that they've created there. Those partnerships, those cross-cultural networks, are driving the company's development. And it looks like a nightmare from London, but actually what's happening is it's creating these very enduring, very well-entrenched economic and political partnerships that are yielding the kinds of profits and political and judicial rights that the company have never enjoyed. So, for example, 1640, a band of servants without any knowledge from headquarters in London single-handedly established the city of the factory of Fort St. George at Madras Patnam, which is just south of down on the Coromandel coast, and they build a fort and they trade customs free, and they invite Indo-Portuguese weavers and Indian dyers, and suddenly by the 1660s they've got probably single most profitable and important settlement in the company's history. And the company disagree with it, and they try and stop it, and they try and starve it of funds, but they can't, because it's almost entirely built purely on the relationship between individual company servants there and the local elites that have all the money and all the power and all the patronage. And the company can't do much about it, and there's a massive tension there. And at one point, the company try and disenfranchise Madras, and Madras rebels and is independent for about 3 years. It's taken over by a kind of coalition of Europeans and Indians, and the company have to get a proclamation from King Charles II, send out a fleet of warships, and only then, after 3 years, do they regain control of Madras. So these cross-cultural networks have driven the company's development to such an extent that the English state or its domestic metropolitan authorities just really don't have control of the way the company's developed anymore.
Mhm. Great, thank you. And I think you've addressed my next question about Madras, so perfect. Thank you.
Good.
So skipping to the next question, in parts 2 and 3, you explore two contrasting political and social dynamics in Bengal on the Indian subcontinent and the island of Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia that company officials had to adapt to. Could you talk about what looking at these two case studies together tells us about the entrenchment of the company's presence in Asia in the 17th century?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I came to the study of the East India Company through Sumatra. I just felt like no one was doing any work on it really in this period. Most people that were working on Sumatra or Europeans in Sumatra were looking at the later Dutch period, and I just felt it was completely neglected, and so that's kind of really okay. And I found that the sources on Sumatra were just so exciting and so rich, and so that's I thought this would make a good comparison because my argument that the company generally was accommodated and contained by Asian states and elites within existing structures of power is a nice kind of non-violent narrative, and it's too clean and whilst the company generally did subordinate themselves and did act according to the interests and demands of the Asian elites that they had to work with and for. It doesn't mean that there was an entire absence of violence and coercion and conquest, and that's far from it. Even within the Mughal context, for example, this conflict, and in the 1680s, it spills out into war between the government of Bengal and the company there. So conflict is a part of it, but I wanted to really, in a way, by looking at Sumatra, to show that Europeans in Asia were violent and coercive in this period. This is not a sanitized new argument to suggest otherwise. There is violence and coercion. It's happening in Asia, maybe not so much in India in this period. So I wanted to focus on that, and but in doing that, then I also wanted to reinforce my argument that the company sought to work within powerful Asian frameworks, but not all states in Asia were powerful, and when they weren't powerful and they couldn't they couldn't accommodate and absorb the company and integrate them and dominate them, then the company would attempt to vice versa. They would attempt to dominate those states. So in a way, it reinforces the argument that company success came from working within these powerful hosts. But when those hosts weren't so powerful, the company were more than happy to use violence and coercion. So even within India, it's not that they subordinated themselves to the Mughal Empire because they were nice people or they wanted to do good. They just knew they couldn't take on the Mughal Empire, and therefore success could only come from acting subservient and integrating themselves. And Sumatra is a fantastic way to show that if those limits were not placed on Europeans, then Europeans were would happily and very quickly revert to violence to get what they wanted. So the Sumatran context really, I think, was a good case study. It tells us that the company, in building its own frameworks of power in Asia, it was always disastrous. It's always predicated on violence and extraction and coercion. So those places outside of big imperial frameworks, whether it's Japan or Golconda or the Mughal Empire or Safavid Persia, when the company tried to go its own, for example, in Bombay, Bombay was transferred to the company in the 1660s, and the company held its sovereignty directly. It was not enfranchised by the Mughal Empire or anyone else. And Bombay was a bit of a disaster for at least most of the late 17th and early 17th century. The directors wanted to make it a good, godly Christian colony, and it wasn't anything like that. And it struggled to grow, and it was eclipsed by its surrounding Asian neighbours, and it was a disaster. Repeated attempts to colonize Madagascar, disaster. These were smaller powers, and the company always reverted to war and conquest and famine and extraction, and the whole thing tended to collapse. So, in a way, success only came from working within the larger powers of Asia. So, Sumatra is an interesting case study in the late 17th century because the west coast of Sumatra itself has a number of large powers on it. For example, Jambi on the east coast. The Sultanate of Banten ruled the southern part of Sumatra, the Lampong. But on the west coast of Sumatra, it's about 300 miles of coast, which is divided into at least a dozen, maybe more, individual powers. Most of them riverine districts with autonomy. Some of them sultanates with kind of regional ambitions. A couple of them pursued a kind of imperial ideology, and but generally, there were small powers unable to accommodate the company's demands for sweeping rights, such as customs-free trade or the government over entire cities. Demographically, the West Coast was lightly populated. It had few resources. It was driven almost entirely by the pepper trade. Pepper was cultivated up in the highlands, brought down to the coastal plains, where it was sold in several ports. So the company's ambition to monopolize the pepper trade, to fortify the few cities of the coast, could not be accommodated by these small polities. And just within, I'd say, 4 or 5 years, the company started to coerce these powers and to extract those rights by force. And it's really embroiled in I'd say, at least 30 years of war, continuous war on the West Coast, and in really what's a kind of almost identical to what happens in Bengal in the later 18th century, a kind of cyclical dynamic of war, annexation of territory, more responsibility, greater costs, trade is vanished, this famine. It plays out almost exactly as it would in Bengal almost 100 years later. And by the 1720s, the company's presence is more territorial than commercial, and it has a series of puppet rulers through which it rules indirectly. But in 1719, a coalition of Malay powers comes together and manages to destroy the company's presence there. So, and they're expelled from the coast, and they return later, but in a very much diminished kind of way. So, by comparing, for example, the company's presence in Bengal, a wealthy, powerful province of the Mughal Empire, able to absorb the company's presence, provide it with customs-free trade. Eventually, after a brief conflict, which the company loses, integrates the company into its political framework, provides it with certain rights. In return, the company helped defeat a rebellion against the Bengali government, and the company are awarded with even greater rights. They fortify Calcutta, and they become one of the most important economic actors in Bengal by the early 18th century. Mughal Empire can do that. It's powerful enough, it's wealthy enough, and the west coast of Sumatra can't do that. And the consequence is the company then resorts to coercion and violence. So I thought these made two fantastic contrasts. One, to say the local contexts in Asia matter the most. This is really what comes from the kind of Asian genesis of empire. We can't look to Europe to understand the development of European empires because it's completely dependent upon the local context. How the company operate in Bengal is entirely different to how it operates in Sumatra. So the development of the company, the origins of the British Empire are diverse, and they are very much dependent on the various regions of Asia that the company operates. Southeast Asia is entirely different to the subcontinent, and the subcontinent is entirely different to East Asia, to Japan and China. So I think we need to look at these individual. There's no single narrative for how the company develops. So I think these case studies are really important. Often, especially British historians, we just think of India when we think of the East India Company. But we can't do that.
Great. Thank you so much. So in the next part 4, you give an alternative reading of how the company became a territorially expansive actor in India in the 18th century. Could you talk about how the Mughal decline and the emergence of British colonial rule in India have been discussed in the literature and how your work challenges these arguments?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, towards the end of the book, then we get to the fabled mid 18th century. Obviously, the 18th century in the historiography as India is such a intimidating, massive field of study. Such eminent Indian scholars have weighed in and carved out, their particular arguments. And so, taking my argument into the mid 18th century was a bit scary, but and I was wondering how it would work, how the research would kind of lead that argument. And obviously, this is the period in which, from 1757, the company started to become a kind of territorial power in India on a scale that it hadn't before. So, as my book shows, and other work by other scholars such as Phil Stern show, that the company had always had a territorial presence, although it had been rather small. From 1757 onwards, that changes, and by the end of the 18th century, it's obviously dominant, and that dominance comes at the expense of indigenous powers in Asia. And obviously, the big narrative is that the Mughal Empire declines, and then the British Empire rises, and the rise of the British Empire is predicated on the decline of the Mughal Empire, and not just based on that, but is entwined in that narrative that the East India Company exploited the decline of the Mughal Empire, and so I was wondering how my argument would work in that instance. Some Indian scholars, very very heavily have stuck to this idea that the company's expansion was at the expense of the Mughal Empire, and had the company not expanded, the Mughal Empire, may well have carried on. But so this really, for the mid 18th century, it's a really doubling down on this idea of the company and the company's expansion, Mughal expansion, as being mutually exclusive, and the two. There wasn't room for both, like there had been in the 17th century. But actually, what I found looking at the 18th century and looking at the sources is that the company is not the hammer blow for the Mughal Empire. In many ways, the company's continued expansion within the Mughal framework of power, drawing its rights through charters and farmans from the imperial centre. Creating networks of patronage with Mughal elites, upholding Mughal authority in the provinces, acting subordinately to Mughal economic interests. These things continue on into the mid 18th century. The only big change I could see, really, is that they need to, a lot of these need to be renegotiated at the local level more, with the emergence of the successor states in Bengal and in Hyderabad and Oudh. And yet, in many ways, the company had always negotiated their powers with local elites. They had been doing that since the mid 17th century. It's just that these elites were more powerful. They were, the new nawabs of these successor states, more capable themselves of dominating the East India Company. So it's not that the mid 18th century collapsed this dynamic of the company working subordinately inside the Mughal Empire. In fact, for many ways, for me, the mid 18th century, or certainly the first half of the 18th century, this dynamic is intensified as the Mughal Empire struggles with external invasion by Persian or Afghan armies and the plunder of Delhi, or by internal rebellion and its war with the Maharathas, for example, and certain domestic crises, Jagadir crisis, and declining revenue and imperial overstretch. In many ways, it then relies more on its subordinate actors to uphold its authority and increase its revenue. So the Mughal Empire in the first half of the 18th century is willing to concede more rights and more powers to the East India Company. But the East India Company don't have an interest in undermining this dynamic. Why would they? This is the for them, it's the goose that's laying the golden eggs. They don't want to end that. So far from undermining the Mughal Empire and exasperating its crises in the mid-18th century, the company worked hard to uphold Mughal sovereignty because Mughal sovereignty is where their own rights and powers lie. Their rights to customs-free trade, for example, their rights to fortify their settlements and their factories, their rights to enjoy the jurisdiction of surrounding territories. They're drawn still from Delhi. And so the company often is invoking Mughal authority and sovereignty in negotiating with the emerging local elites like the new Nawabs of the successor states. So in a way, the company is working harder to uphold the Mughal Empire, and it's working overtime as a Mughal subordinate actor to do that. So my argument was that by the mid-18th century, far from the Mughal Empire collapsing and the company engineering undermining that, in fact, the company is working hard to prop the Mughal Empire up. And I saw this, for example, looking at a good example is once they get the famous Imperial famine in 1717, the company consolidate all of its previous charters. They enjoy even more rights. The new 1717 farmer gives them customs-free trade throughout all of India. It grants them new villages and towns and their surrounding settlements. And this is a massive boon. It's hard to quantify just how much the company gained from this because their commercial operations are expanding anyway. But it looks like it gave the company a massive advantage over its European rivals as well as over other Asian commercial rivals as well. And it consolidates and entrenches the company's political and jurisdictional presence in the Mughal Empire as well. So in trying to actualize some of these rights from the 1717 famine, for example, Madras gains an additional number of towns that it can in its jurisdiction on the Coromandel coast, but these are contested by the Nawabs of the Carnatic and Hyderabad as well, because as they're emerging and they're putting together their own semi-independent states, what they want doesn't always align with what Delhi wants, and therefore the company finds not only has it had to negotiate for the farm in Delhi, but now it has to renegotiate with several important local elites to make sure it gains possession of those towns and can expand its borders and gets to enjoy its customs-free trade. So there's more layers of negotiation and there are new actors being folded into the equation, but the company is still largely operating as it always had done. In fact, my book argues that the company was doing more to make sure that the overarching system, the Mughal imperial framework that it enjoyed all of its success from, remained strong and robust as much as possible. So it kind of, this idea of the Mughal decline, partly undermined by the rise of the company, and then the company exploiting this decline to emerge dominant. I didn't see that in the sources. I saw quite the opposite. It's the company doing everything it could to make sure the golden goose continued laying the eggs. I think I've flogged that analogy to death. But for me, I just didn't understand why would the company, actively undo a system that that was working so well for it.
Great. Thank you. That's such a novel argument and a really interesting one. Thank you for laying it out for us. So before we end the discussion of the company, changing gears slightly, we've been discussing how your work fits into the historiography, but I was wondering if you could tell us, briefly your thoughts on how the company is portrayed in non-academic conversations or in popular media. In doing so, perhaps you could reflect on William Dalrymple's recent book on the company, The Anarchy. I have not read it, but I believe it's a bestseller, and I think there might even be a TV series being made based on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think right now, obviously, we're seeing a really important point in the way in which academic imperial research and history is relating to its wider public audience. First of all, I'd have to say that I think there's a real disconnect between the two. I think that the public conversation about empire and its legacies and the way we think about it and talk about it is really being led by popular histories. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's really important, but I don't think that academic research on empire and the East India Company is reaching a public audience enough, and I think that that's leading to the public conversation taking a rather dangerous and sinister turn in a way, turning back to the old Victorian discourse of empire as something to be proud of and something deeply embedded in the national fabric, and this discourse over greatness and patriotism, which is just so anyone who studies empire has in the past 50 years knows just such a step back in the way we think of empire and the company. And so for me, it's quite horrifying what's going on at the moment. And I feel like in many ways, academic historians looking at empire and company really are partly to blame in not reaching out to a wider audience sooner enough or more. So I think there's a lot of work to do to make an impact on the current conversation in the public and political spheres. And I think that the company, first of all, it's not the company. The history of the company is always conflated with the history of the British Empire and the later British Raj in India of the 19th century. I don't think the company itself is portrayed in a particularly visible way in non-academic conversations or in popular media. And I think that really William Dalrymple's probably almost certainly in the British non-academic conversation and media. I think that's really he's really almost single-handedly the one shaping the kind of non-specialist understanding of this topic. And I think that other than being invoked as a cautionary tale for corporations in the modern day, and having read William Dalrymple's book, which by the way I think is a fantastic narrative history, one that really acts as a vehicle for I think commentary on modern capitalism and its dangers of allowing corporations to run rampant, which I think is a really important point to make. And I think he does a fantastic job of showing the way in which empire, is destructive and leads to legacies of inequality and exploitation. But I think that this needs to happen on a much larger scale, and I think the company needs to be evoked not just as a cautionary tale about corporations, but it needs to be more integrated into our understanding of empire. The company wasn't exceptional. I mean, it's always invoked as this exceptional, entity in the world, but actually it emerged from a heritage of European empires being decentered and as being kind of outsourced by European states, and as being predicated on coercion and violence in most parts of the world. So I don't think the company is exceptional. I think we need to come away from that narrative, and I think that we need to do more to engage public audiences with not that cautionary tale of the company as a corporation, but as a manifestation of European empire. I don't think we can just understand it in its corporate context. That's really important. I think that, one of the things, the other thing that the anarchy does is it almost solely focuses on the Indian subcontinent. Mostly because, it suffers from what I spoke about earlier, is most history starting really in the 18th century. I mean, the anarchy covers the earlier period in its first chapter, then the rest of its chapters are almost squarely focused on the Plassey period and onwards. So again, you're telling a story from the middle of the book. You're not looking, you're not going back to the beginning, which is super important. And so I think that there's a rich opportunity here, I think, to feed into the public discourse about empire, and the company is probably the best way to do that. So yeah, I think this is a chance for historians of empire and the company to make a big impact, and I hope they do.
Great. Thank you so much. And I've taken way too much of your time. So thank you so much for giving up so much of your time to do this podcast. But before I let you leave, could you just tell us what you're working on now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talking about public audiences, I kind of pivoted slightly for my next book, which I'm writing at the moment, will be published by Penguin for a non-academic audience, and it will be a narrative history of the early modern British Empire. From 1500 to 1800. So it's looking at 3 centuries.
Fascinating.
It's looking at the early modern world, but it's attempting to do it not not from the British perspective, but it's looking at it's really a history of the early modern world at the moment of British expansion, and it's attempting to come away from narratives which really cast the early modern world as this kind of passive victim of British colonialism, and many of these cultures and societies do fall victim to British imperialism. But what the book is trying to do is gives them their agency back, and to show that many of these shaped the British as much as the British were themselves able to shape these cultures and societies. So it will be looking at the way in which the non-European world was a powerful, rich, diverse place able to resist British imperialism and to shape its own history well into the 18th century. So it's a new history, I think, of the British Empire, one from a non-British perspective. So we'll be looking at, for example, Shivaji and the Maharathas in India, and the way in which that was the kind of key narrative story, and not the rise of Bombay, for example, which was on the fringes of Western India for much of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It's looking at the colonization, for example, of North America as being very uneven and haphazard, and the way in which the English schemes were wrecked or reshaped by indigenous Native American cultures and societies. I'm just finishing a chapter on Bantam, the Sultanate of Bantam, for example. And the way in which the East India Company completely failed to achieve commercial success there, losing out to more important commercial groups like the Chinese, for example. So it's kind of rewriting the history of England and Britain in the early modern period, not as being this inevitable dominant force, but actually being a bit of a failure and being actually shaped more by the cultures and societies they encountered than they themselves were actually capable of doing. So it's taking, in a way, the premise of this my first book that we've been discussing, and painting on a much larger canvas to show that the early modern world was a resilient, complex, capable and powerful place, and the English were just one component of that, not the dominant narrative.
Great, that sounds fascinating and a really important book. So thank you so much, and good luck. Good luck with your writing.
Thank you, and thanks again for having me on. Much appreciated.